Okay, I think we are live now. So we are just waiting for James. He's there.
Ooh,
And there you go.
um, there we go.
You're right.
I'm good. Yeah. How are you?
Yeah, good. It's been a really long day, but it's getting there. So there you go.
Yeah,
And this is the highlight of the day for me. So thank you for being here. Because yeah, this has been the moment I've been sort of building up to, sort of like, it's okay, I have something exciting to do at 7. It's fine, I can do this.
yeah. So it's been a very long day. I've been working on applications today, as well as doing a little bit of marking. So it's nice to be talking rather than behind a screen. Just reading and reading and reading.
No, I get you. I've been mostly doing admin stuff and preparing 10 guided tours. So it's been the same, just research, 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 and more research, which
Yeah.
is very draining. It's
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
it's too much. Too much.
Mm.
But yeah, thank you so much for being here today. We can get started whenever you want. We have to be done before 8 because I have to move on to my next appointment.
That's right. No,
But yeah,
I assumed it was only going to be, I didn't
yeah,
even think it would be an hour actually. So yeah, whenever, I don't mind.
awesome. And just to let you know, we will be, well, I'll be posting this on YouTube at a later date, just because
Brilliant.
we moved from one place to another. So I'll pass you all the details. It's kind of just handy doing these things on Instagram because it just kind of stays there and then people can watch it until later.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
Yeah.
if you can maybe start with introducing yourself for people who may not know you.
Yeah, so I'm James Jeffries. I'm a research student, PhD candidate at the University of Essex. I'm also an assistant lecturer at Essex. So I'm teaching on two modules, one called The Making of the Modern World, sort of looking at history from 1750 to today, really. Another one that I did in the autumn term, which is Becoming a Historian. So it's general sort of, it's a first year module, so it's about approaches to history and kind of moving to that next step away from A levels, where you're starting to think more critically and objectively about things and thinking about various factors, think about historiography and what's been written about history before, the usual things. And I'm also an assistant lecturer at University of Wolverhampton. So this spring I've been teaching on a module about the strategic bombing during the Second World War, which is linked a little bit more to my thesis. So the other two modules are quite broad. This one's a bit more specific, so yeah, it's a little bit more testing in that sense. So kind of like, this is the stuff you should be studying as well, James.
Yeah,
But
right. I mean, I completely relate. It's a lot of people don't realize that when you go into sort of lecturing in academia, it may not be necessarily what you were pan out to do. A
yeah,
Viking medieval specialist teaching the Golden Age of Spain. It's fine, absolutely fine. So these things happen. But yeah, no, it's good having that variety. I think it's sort of. I always found that it sort of helped me having that sort of like research cleanser in my brain, like,
yeah,
because otherwise you can sort of get really really focused on like one particular field, and it
yeah.
was like a nice break. It's got nothing to do with my subject. I can ignore what I'm looking at for a moment and then come back to it.
I've
Sort of thing.
Yeah, I've loved it because we've gone right back. So the thing that I've really enjoyed about the Making of the Modern World is it looks specifically initially at themes. So it considers the history of gender, for example. It considers a history of identity and such like. And it's like, these are quite huge topics that aren't really, you
Yeah,
jump in, you think, oh, it's going to be, I don't know, about the American Revolution straight off or something like that. And it's like, actually, let's look at these topics that spread over history that you can then you can just look at so much. It's so exciting as well. And then look at why certain histories haven't been looked at before. And then that really, hopefully, I hope it fires the students up in the sense of, thinking differently and thinking about why these histories have been neglected and what histories can be examined in the future, which I think is really, really important. And like you say, it's great to get out of your sort of normal zone So it's great to travel back to the late 1700s and go, oh, what, I'm on my toes here. I really need to,
Yeah, no, like it is funny, at least for me, because I'm sort of quite a curious researcher anyway. Like I sort of see shiny somewhere and I sort of just go there like, oh, this is fun, I'll do that. But I just always thought that it was just nice having that sort of breaking point, which is
Yeah.
sort of the reason why I probably enjoyed my first 2 years of university better than the last one, because the last one is like very,
Mm,
very focused, kind of like you're looking down the barrel. Whilst
yeah.
in the first one and the second one, you can do a bit more stuff with a lot more variety. So I could still concentrate in the medieval studies that I wanted, but I may have like a modern history module, and it was like, ooh, exciting. So
Yeah.
you know what I mean? But no, it's I think particularly the sort of foundation year modules are just very important for a lot of history
Mm,
students, and they just don't think about it. I mean, I know that because I didn't think that
yeah.
when I started doing it. But they ended up being some of the most useful modules that I ever did for my career later on as a researcher. So it's, it is always good to sort of keep those going and
Mm,
trying to sort of see students grow in that sense. Because
mm,
I think that's often like an aha moment for a lot of people studying history. It's the
yeah.
moment when they realize, actually, this is definitely for me, or the moment when you're like, nope, I'm doomed. And it is important because I think a lot of people sort of come into history thinking, oh, it's just all about reading like history
Yeah.
books and learning some nice stories and that's it. And they don't actually realize some of the analytic skills that you need to develop, some of the,
Mm,
well, just traditional research, which is not just reading through books and books, but sort of like looking for sources, tracing
mm.
people back on a particular history path or whatever. And they are not for everyone. I mean, let's face it.
Oh,
This
yeah.
is it's not to put anyone off, by the way. For those of you watching, we're not saying don't do it. It's just not
Mm,
it. It's a type of skill set that just doesn't resonate with absolutely everyone, and
mm,
that's fine. We don't all enjoy the same things,
yeah.
but it is important to sort of have those touching stones to
Yeah.
sort of move along. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I'm obviously biased. I'm going to say history is the best subject, but I try and pass that energy on when I'm teaching. And yeah, I mean, the reason why I think history is so exciting is because, there is the old cliche of learning from the past to understand where we are now, or the old saying, and towards the future. But when you think about it, and I think about that a little bit deeper, everything is history. Everything has a history, whatever you look at. So you could say, I don't like history, I like science. And it's like, well, there's a history behind that. How did these questions come about? Why did we start looking at the universe differently? And you say, I'm a chemist. And you think, well, you need to know about the composition of something, and you need to know how that's developed. And yeah, there's a history behind that. So that's why I think it's exciting. And it's just whatever angle you come in on. I think
yeah,
most people can get excited about it. So that's my selling point when it comes to history, and that's what I try and get across. And the other thing with especially the modules that I've taught on, is it's looking away from history, from the top down. It's considering the wider history. So we've done loads of weeks, but one that I found particularly exciting was about China,
ooh,
which, to my confession, I didn't know a great deal about.
mm-hmm.
So going into that and teaching about it was like, this is fascinating. Actually, this is hugely influential on the world. And it's like, this needs to be told. This needs to be brought forward. So it is very, very exciting. Well, as I say, I'm absolutely biased, obviously, because it's what I do. But that's what I try and sell it on, as it were. That's what I try and hopefully get across when I lecture or when I speak. Or yeah, and like I said, again, and it's great to get out of your comfort zone and test yourself and learn these new incredible things. Absolutely, yeah.
No, I relate. I'm very much the same. And, particularly when you said history of China, it's
Oh,
something we did a session about it recently with the other James, the Roman historian who also does
oh,
reenactment.
wow.
And we were using the Total War engine to recreate ancient battles and talk about it. And a lot of people just didn't know about this particular one we were covering, which was the Battle of Red Cliff, which is
Mm,
actually one of the most influential battles in the history of China, period. And you could arguably say one of the most influential battles in the ancient world because
mm,
it just shapes everything that happens in China during that particular moment in time,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
one of the main reasons why China doesn't expand anymore for a great span of 100 years. And if we look at the potential places where China was going during those 100 years, the world would have looked like a very different place if that battle wouldn't have happened. So I love it when you can just bring, like, you know, those little nuggets into people who maybe didn't know about it, and suddenly it's like, you know, our horizons really expand.
Yeah.
But it is fascinating, and you're absolutely right. There is a bit of history for absolutely everyone. This is something people who come on tours with me, people who do research with me, hear me in conferences, are probably tired of hearing me say this. But it is true, because, you know, history is you and me. History is everyone watching this now or later. It's everybody. There is history in absolutely everything that we do, everything that we see, even if it may not seem like influential history, right? Like the most important type of history, but everything has an impact in the world, and therefore it shapes reality. So if there is something that you like, there is, you know, a backlog of how you got to that stage personally as a human being, and how that thing got to you. So there is an angle for absolutely everyone. It's just, I think a lot of people sort of see it as the typical thing that you get in schools about just learning about dates and specific things like that, and I'm like, I'm not here for that. I am the worst for dates to begin with. So
Funnily enough, my supervisor said, never ask a historian about dates of when things happened, because we will not know. We could tell you about the context, we could tell you about what happened, but you go, was it the 14th of May, 17th? No, it was, you know, don't, because that's, we forget. It's interesting, actually, that you raised the topic of video games. That's something that I study. And again, my other supervisor has written extensively on, as well as history and Star Wars, which is actually really, really cool. Plug to me the fourth there. Yes. And there's a lot in video games. People just think, oh, it's a silly little thing and it's daft. And but there's actually a lot of interpretation that can be taken from it in terms of what history is selected, how it's portrayed, who's represented, who's not represented. And it really raises some absolutely massive questions. And one thing that a lot of people do when it comes to video games, that they talk about accuracy. And it's always something about kind of like, well, they wouldn't have had that sort of sword. They was wearing the wrong hat and everything. But actually, the main question is, what is it saying about that epoch, you know, or all those people? I mean, you know, there's a lot of questions. I mean, I've been recently looking at Battlefield 5. And one of the questions with that is, there was a huge sort of anger at how it was portrayed, women on the front line, and people were very angry about this and the representation of soldiers and such like. When actually there was quite a controversial chapter that made this Panzer troop, these Nazi troops, look like good guys, and it's like, surely that's the one that you should be raising questions on, you know. But again, it's about, there's different angles that come in that are looking at, or I mean, another one I'm looking at, again linked to my thesis, is I'm looking at a game called Bomber Crew. That basically the game is about you being leading this crew within an RAF bomber that drops bombs on targets, and it's really asking a lot of questions, because not only is it looking very cute and they're very cartoony and friendly, and it's like, this is a pretty heavy topic, you know. The bombs always hit the target. You don't see the collateral damage. You know, there's no consequences. There's no wider questions. You know, and you just suddenly, when you look at it from that angle, you start going, why is this being chosen? Why is this being done like this? What's it say about the popular memory? Who designed it? And there's all these questions that I think are actually very, very important. So when people come to, they could look at that and just go, oh, it's a silly video game about flying an aeroplane and you drop bombs. And it's like, no, there's some big questions here that should be asked. And, you know, even some historians go, oh, it's not worth the time. And it's like, isn't it? Because it goes to a wide audience. And, you know, future generations, what's being passed down. We think about films in the same light, or magazines, or, you know, comics or whatever. But video games, I think we're still a little bit behind, which is something I want to delve into, you know.
No, you know, everything that you've talked about is literally my jam. This is how I made
Yeah.
a name for myself with the Vikings, because when I started my thesis, I was like, I've been reading these comic books about Vikings, which actually portray Vikings who are human beings rather than
Mm.
just savage, raping
With the horse.
villagers,
Yeah.
which is what most historians, even to that stage, were still portraying them as, and that we know is blatantly untrue.
Yeah.
So what the hell? Why do you want me to keep on banging on that door when there's clearly people out here doing something different? I think
Mm.
that says something about the public. I think that says that we know that history is not that black and white, and that people
Mm-hmm.
want to explore other narratives. And the reason why they want to explore other narratives is because they're interested in
Mm.
that particular moment in time. And I started sort of going down that area very, very early on. And I mean, I'm a nerd overall, so it wasn't really hard in that sense. But it's honestly, the subject of representation in history and popular culture is just so
Mm.
incredibly undervalued. And in video
Mm.
games, you're absolutely right. I only started delving with video games very, very end towards the end of my PhD in terms of academic discourse. But this is something that I've been saying for years. But there's a moment when you need to say, I cannot put anything else on the PhD. And I was like, I can't really add anything else. But it's very interesting, and it's very compelling. And actually, the other James, you two should probably have a conversation at some
It
point.
sounds like we should. Yeah. Yeah.
He he his investigation sort of draws from the fact that in some ways, particularly for military historians, or when we're talking about military history, video games in a way sort of are like modern reenactment. You're just
Yeah. Yeah.
bringing something to life, but in a safe space, right? Where
Mm.
people don't necessarily get hurt. So, obviously, when he's doing reenactment, he cannot go to the battlefield and fully kill someone. That would be murder. But there is nothing stopping a video game from actually enacting that level. So
Mm.
why do we choose not to show that? And when we choose to show that, what does that say about us, etc.? Or,
Yeah.
now we have VR. VR is really taking over the market, is really expanding all of these fields. And it sort of makes you think, maybe this is a different way where we
Mm.
could engage with history, whether it's actually for people to realize how horrible a battle would have been
Yeah.
back in the
Absolutely.
day, or whether it is for them to realize that the landscape would have been completely different, or the living conditions, working conditions, etc. So it is a huge tool and resource that I think as historians we sort of really should appreciate and should utilize.
Yeah.
But as usual, when you are dealing with, I'm not gonna use the words that have brought me to trouble before, but when you're dealing with a really backwards community, and
Mm.
unfortunately, the vast majority of historians are still a very backwards community, because there is a series of like elitist hoops and classes and cliques that you sort of need to belong in or not. It is hard to sort of fight against the tide. But there are
Mm.
people, I think, people like you and me, some other people that I can think of, that are starting to say, this is the now, and this is the future. And if we want to stay relevant, we need to embrace the future.
Yeah.
But it is something that, honestly, if it was utilized in A levels, in universities for learning at that sort of stuff, I think it would really open the eyes of a lot of people who are quite sort of unaware
Mm.
of all of the material that we are creating as a society, and that is going to outlast us. So we
Yeah.
should be doing
Yeah.
something about that, you know?
Yeah. 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 And through these popular things, video games, films, TV, we learn a lot about how we want to see history and how it's reflected. I mean, another thing that I'm looking at is looking at television, and how certainly in Britain it's very nostalgic. It's very,
Oh my God.
it's in it. I don't want to say too much, but it's in a certain box, shall we say, that
Yes.
ticks certain things. And there's a few that challenge that, but a lot fall into this nostalgic, oh, wasn't it lovely then? Oh, well, there was a little bit of trouble, but it was okay, and it's like, is that really, and isn't it a more interesting story anyway to have those nuances and those complexities and those different voices coming forward? I think it is. I think actually if people were made aware of them, they'd find it is as well. And that's hopefully what we're going to do. Yeah, fingers crossed.
But I mean, film is the other thing, and TV that I look at. And actually, I moved away from film into TV specifically because the
Mm.
audience is different,
Yeah.
for starters. And in a way, just because my studies were parallel, I sort of came to the realization that the same audience that would read a comic book has a lot more in common with the audience that would follow a TV, because it's sequential, right? It goes in
Mm.
series, it goes in episodes. It's not the same that when you go to the movies, you watch them one time, you're done. It's fine. If you're doing something like watching a TV show, I mean, it's changed a bit now because of binge culture. But if
Mm.
you're doing something like watching a TV show, you have a certain level of dedication, right? You
Yeah.
are invested. You want to continue that narrative. You want to find out how it happens. And the approaches in TV shows are actually very different, or at least different to an extent, to what we show just on mainstream cinema.
Mm.
Obviously, we could then start talking about things that are not mainstream cinema, and why, it's
Mm.
just never ending, never ending sort of groping there. But there is so many things in there that have to do with our memory, with our historical
Mm.
memory as a society now. And it speaks, I think, more than any memorial, any
Mm.
statue, or anything like that that we put out there.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, these statues, these memorials, etc., are done with money from the government, 9 times out of 10.
Mm.
While these other projects are, they have different people, they have different voices and opinions. And those are the voices and opinions of a much wider audience who may not have certain political agendas, or,
Mm.
certain views that they want to promote, or
Mm.
they do,
Mm.
but they do them from a different perspective. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it is something that we definitely need to start.
Mm.
Well, I would like to say we should really go in depth, because I think, it is 2021. TV
Mm.
has been around now for nearly a century. We really should have done a lot more with this, but we definitely have to sort of, get out there and actually own the fact that history is for everyone and is done by
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
need to stop being gatekeepers, which I think is something well, I say we, not necessarily us we, but the wider historical community. I think it's something we're very guilty of, sort of
Mm.
deciding who can participate and who can't.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in this day and age, that's a tired story.
Yeah.
It's no longer valid.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
it's yeah.
yeah. No, I was just, you've got me thinking actually about, so if any of my students are watching before 9 a.m. tomorrow, I'm going to spoil everything for you, but you're probably not. You're probably, yeah. So I came across a Hovis bread advert, British Hovis bread, probably one of the most famous bread companies in Britain, and they did an anniversary advert on TV, and it got me thinking actually about even advertisements and links to history and such like. But this advert, the thing that really sparked me, so the main part of my thesis is looking at the First and Second World War and how it's remembered in Britain, and how they're remembered very, very differently. And I'm specifically looking at the war in the air because that's what I do. I'm an aviation historian more than anything else, I guess. But what was really telling was you had two segments, and the First World War is probably the lengthiest segment in this advert. And it's what the advert essentially is this boy who's running through streets, and he bumps into various periods of history. And the advert at the end says, Hovis has been there for you for the last 100 years. So it goes through a parade of suffragettes. It goes through later on people celebrating the World Cup in 1966. And then it shows you the millennium and all sort of stuff. But as I say, the First World War segment is very telling because it's of soldiers marching to battle. And it's quite a lengthy scene. I say lengthy, it's seconds, but it's longer than the other segments. This boy weaves his way in between the soldiers, and he turns, looks, salutes, and one of the soldiers salutes back. And it's very much the soldiers going off to war. They're fighting this battle far away. And it's that nod to that sacrifice of the First World War, etc. You jump to the Second World War, and it's of a blitzed out city. And you've got people going through the rubble with their possessions. and there's an open window with a radio, and Churchill is doing his "This is their finest hour" speech. A Spitfire flies over, and it's very sort of like, and I immediately thought that the memory of those two wars is the First World War is one that's very far away. It's about the Western Front. It's about soldiers, British soldiers fighting. Whereas the Second World War is about that war coming to Britain and about staunch finest hour and such like. And I mean, there's obviously elements of truth in this, absolutely. But there's so much more to unpick with that, you know. And they're full of cliches and a narrative that's very embedded in British memory of the war. You know, Britain's contribution to the Second World War was the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, Dunkirk and such like. And it's not really thinking about, I don't know, Operation Overlord. It's not, you know, and the air war, it's that sense of modernity in the Second World War. And of course, in the First World War, there were raids. German naval ships in 1914 shelled towns in Yorkshire, Scarborough, Whitby, for example. But they're things that are kind of forgotten about. It's still that far away war. And I mean, yeah, you think about the First World War, a lot of, I mean, you think about the French, you know, huge battles at Verdun, the Marne, etc. And then you think, actually, why do you think about what was happening in Mesopotamia, Iraq now, etc., etc. So, Sinai Desert. You think about what was happening in Africa, what was happening in the sea. You think what was happening, and you think, yeah, it's still this very much this war. And if you come across and you mention these other things to people, I didn't know about that, you know. And the same goes with the Second World War. There's a lot that's not, you know, it's still Eurocentric. It's still very, you know, and it's just from an advert, it sparks all this from me. But it's gonna still embed certain notions and emotions and ideas and collective memories of these events, and I find that absolutely fascinating. You know, I want to know why that is.
Yeah, it's literally one of the reasons why I started. Well, the way I started working with my studies was very much because of that. I was like, why did we choose to think this was the right thing to remember and not what? And while I was doing a lot of the historiographic background, I came about a book. I will never forget it, the title, but I can't remember anything else. And it's actually called Historical Forgetting, which is more about why certain things, like you say, just kind of fade into the void. Why do we grab that, throw it away, and are like, nope, that definitely doesn't fit in our whatever narrative of this memory that we have? And how it is sometimes very or easier to see in modern history, particularly with wars, because it's more recent, but has been happening since ancient times. Because it's just part like of our DNA almost, that we sort of, you know, choose this is how we want to remember this part of our past, and this is how we want to remember it for the future. And we've been literally doing this, manipulating, crafting, pushing things aside for as long as we've had human society, which is fascinating if you think about it, because this is something that societies have even been doing when they didn't have writing. So let alone as soon as we started doing this. And a lot of people don't realize that, you know, a lot of people don't actually see how even things like a painting is part of that propaganda. And it is propaganda, and I mean it in the widest sense. Every single monument, every single statue that we have, all of these, it is propaganda. Whether you're in favor or against it, it is propaganda. And it's always something I think we've been more conscious of in Spain than in Britain, at least from my perspective of having lived in both societies going through similar things. Because, you know, in Spain we had obviously a civil war, then a really hardcore dictatorship that is still very, very recent in our memory. And the loss of memory of history and memory only came into proper effect, and not in full, in the sort of late 2000s. So it became a really popular topic for people to start discussing and whatnot. So I think that's why we are maybe a bit more aware, because suddenly we were walking, I think people were not necessarily aware that they had been walking through streets that were named after people who had committed atrocities of war or you know, things like that. And suddenly all of this got addressed, and everyone in Spain was like, oh, that was a Franquist general. Oh, that was a, I don't know, a rebel. That was a communist. That was a, something like that. So it sort of brought awareness from that perspective, and I think it had its moment. The issue, I think, in Spain is that because the wound was still very recent,
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
probably wasn't digested properly. It was, I don't know if maybe it was too early, or not necessarily too early, but that people were not necessarily mentally ready to move past the
Mm.
trauma and start assessing the fact that now that we are moved beyond this, we need to actually decide how we want to remember this. But I
Yeah.
think in the UK, it's the narrative has been different, because in many ways, well, the war never properly happened here in that sense.
That's absolutely right. You know, there is the fact that Britain wasn't occupied apart from the Channel Islands, obviously, but they're cut off, etc., etc. And yeah, I think that's a key factor. But this is why historiography is really, really important, as you well know, and I'm sure most people, watching and know. Um, but the evolution of the Second World War is something obviously I'm studying, and you get the war, and then immediately afterwards people want to go, oh, obviously, thank goodness that is over, we need to rebuild the country, we need to sort things out, oh, let's not talk about it. And everyone it was in their memory, it was all part of that. But then in the 1950s, you start getting a few memoirs being written, you then start getting a few films being made, and this interest comes in with people that might have been just a little bit too young to remember it. Their target audience for certain films, comics, etc., come into it, toys. By the 1960s, that escalates even more. And there is this, as well as that, you've then got the 50th anniversary of the First World War coming up in the 60s, just as these thoughts of the Second World War. And then you get this kind of, well, the First World War, gosh, this is not what I think, this is the general narrative. There was a sense of complete futility compared to the Second World War, which was the good war, etc., etc. And it's then kind of suggested in popular media, etc. And then that drives on into the 70s, and the First World War kind of takes this back step for a while until the 90s. But the Second World War takes over, and it is this dominant memory that comes through, and it carries on. And then obviously veterans, etc., grow older and pass away, and these memories are passed on. But very often, most people still want to get on with their lives. A lot of people, that have spoken to me said, "Oh, my granddad or my dad never spoke about it until right at the end of his life." And again, that comes in with a new thing that comes in. So there's 50th anniversaries in the 90s. So there's a reevaluation, and we're still getting that now. It's like things like we look at the memory of RF Bomber Command, to mention again because that's what I'm talking about. You have a reflection in the 70s with a TV program called The World at War that showed an episode. You have written official histories that come in the 50s and 60s that do their thing, but then it comes to the 90s. The head of Bomber Command during most of the war, Arthur Harris, passes away. There's a statue that's unveiled, and then there's big questions about the morality, and there's booing, and then there's two arguments that kind of get even more voice. And this is just fascinating. Absolutely going off on a tangent here, rambling, but it's absolutely fascinating seeing that these discussions and these viewpoints of history come about because of events afterwards, because of changes afterwards, because of different generations coming in, asking questions, because of the media wanting to look at things differently. You think about the films that are made, I don't know, in the 90s about the Second World War, could never have been made in the 50s or 60s for a number of reasons, But in terms of topic, and not just graphically or anything, or the technology, there's certain messages that are being said. And again, this is fascinating. And as we've said, it happens in video games as well. They've changed a lot the last 20 years, what's being said. First World War video games weren't really a thing until the century. If they were strategic games. They might be board games, but in terms of video games, there wasn't really a lot. And then all of a sudden you get things like Battlefield 1, you get Verdun and Valiant Hearts, probably because it's starting to be okay to make those. Whereas, you've had first-person shooters in the Second World War from the 90s, really, I guess. And on. I mean, you've had arcade games and such like. But there's a reason why they come about before the First World War. It's more of I guess there's marketing involved, but there's more of a an acceptability of having this because it ties in with films like Saving Private Ryan or whatever. There isn't that for the First World War. And again, these are things that I find fascinating. It is this continued story of history changing. And I mean, people go, oh, you can't rewrite history. I mean, well, yeah, that's what historians do. We look at it, we look at what society's saying about it, and we go, okay, let's comment on that. Let's write that. Let's talk about how the story, how the memories are constantly evolving and changing, which I find absolutely fascinating.
It's literally, this is what I tell people, like history is rewriting itself 24/7. You may not be aware of it, you may not be aware that it's happening, and it may even be subconscious, because sometimes we do this, and this is where, when you start assessing history through other sort of like humanities and whatnot, things just start going crazy. Because if you start talking with like sociologists and psychologists about specific periods of time and how that relates with specific historical events, like things just get absolutely bonkers in a good way and in a bad way sometimes. Like the reactions of people and that sort of stuff is very telling. And I mean, this is going to happen with the pandemic in a few years' time, when it sort of moves on. It's going to be really interesting how we are assessing what we as a society went by. But it's literally just part of our, it's almost a non-descriptive part of our job, that we are constantly rewriting it, whether it is for good, to bring those stories that people didn't have a chance to say at the time, or whether it's to bury those stories deeper and further. Matter of fact, it is what we do every time we pick a book and we read and we pass a piece of research along. We are saying, hey, this is worth you knowing or you not knowing or whatever. And it is literally just stirring the pot. Like, I have no better way of saying it. It is stirring the pot, because either you are going against the established order and the established chronology, which is an ongoing issue. And I think our archaeological friends suffer a lot more from this. Like, I hate it every time that we see some amazing find that comes from somewhere that doesn't match anything else that we found, and it just gets discarded as a blip. And it's like, it's not a blip. Obviously something happened there. It's obviously worth looking at, but you're just going to put it in a little box until it repeats itself again. And it may not repeat itself again, because that is your blip. And that blip is important. But it's the same in history. You know, if we think of all of the times that historical documents have been destroyed accidentally or 100% on purpose, or, you know, sources that have been discredited at the time and that come about, you know, later on, or even with paintings, people don't realize how many paintings, which are like now classified as like world-class, you know, state-of-the-art masterpieces, for hundreds of years were like completely discredited or not even appreciated for what they were. And it's something that it is unfortunately part of the cycle that we go through.
And it's all about passing it on. And this is what I found out. Go on, you know, use that and use everything else and try and come to it. But you've actually reminded me of something that people were complaining. I can't remember which TV show it was, but there was a T-Rex that was shown and it had feathers on it. And people were like, that's not a T-Rex. I was like, well, actually, the research now says this. I know it didn't 20 years ago, but we've done a lot more digging, literally, and found this out. And I find that actually more interesting on the reaction of people over this sense of a possession, I guess, actually, over the past, which is very, very interesting. But you're actually right. I mean, if we go back slightly, talk about COVID. I mean, I've got my specific memories of lockdown and COVID and the news and such like, and it's going to be very interesting how people's individual memories are going to be shaped by the wider narratives and histories that are going to come about afterwards. I mean, I think I read somewhere that there's already thousands of books on Amazon. If you type in COVID, people, you know, writing about it, and little guides, funny books and everything. And you think they're going to play their part. Some of those are going to play a big part as well. And historians are going to go back to them in the future. And it really makes you think about the histories that are being written down and how they're going to eventually influence us as individuals, but also as societies, as nations, as communities, whatever. Yeah, and oh gosh, I mean, hopefully we're selling history to people because I'm finding this absolutely fascinating. You know.
I mean, it's, the other thing I think that is going to be really interesting for historians of the future, and I think it's actually starting to become a trend, is social media.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
in a way, our new social media is like a new diary, essentially,
yeah, yeah.
and a new way of showing your personal stories, or a way of assessing how people wanted to be seen during a particular period of time, which has also been something really important and that humans have been doing, for hundreds of years. It's just we've used different tools and different ways of recording this and showing this. So
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
it is literally a very interesting time for both historians and mankind, because
Mhm,
we are sort of in this precipice of the unknown. And I
mhm,
don't mean that just because there are so many questions, right, about what direction our societies are going, but in the unknown of what can we do with the technology that we have, with the knowledge that we have, what is the future going to be looking like with
yeah.
those abilities. And it is kind of interesting. It kind of makes me think that this moment in time that we're living now is probably a lot closer to what medieval monks and medieval society went through around the year 1000 than what we experienced in the year
Mm,
2000. Because people legitimately thought that the world was going to end in the
mm,
year
mm,
1000. And we have lots of historical movements that show, huge chain reactions of hysteria and huge political movements that reflect this. Whilst in the year 2000, I mean, we had some general people who may have felt that way, but that was not the general, we knew it was going to be one more year, whatever. But more and more, there are studies of histories, sociology, etc., that show that the social anxiety of people
mm,
about what's coming next is so big
mm.
that it's just it kind of feels like we've entered a new era.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's going to be really interesting to see how. I mean, we probably won't get to see this, right? Because, well, such is life. But I would love to see what historians in literally 100 years' time will sort of be thinking of what
Mm,
we went through during this century, which is actually going to be,
mm.
I think, very crucial for the development of mankind.
Yeah,
But
and I
that,
mean that's interesting discussion. I mean, social media, but digital history. I mean, yeah, we've got less stuff there physically. It's in the
cloud.
wherever it is, you know.
Yeah.
And then I guess you get questions actually when huge social media platforms are used. Who owns that? And who's going to own it in 100 years' time? What's going to be selected? What's going to be edited? What's going to, there are pretty big questions really to ask here. And like you say, I guess it is the equivalent of a diary, but what was a diary there compared to, I don't know, a video blog or something now is
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
trying to show yourself in an even brighter light than what, I don't know, someone 200 years ago was writing down. Um, and I mean, yeah, I mean, it raises some very, very interesting questions. I mean, less people could read and write 200 years ago is another fact to consider, whereas there's more accessibility here now. But yeah, I mean, people looking at my social media are going to go, that guy just put cat pictures up and aeroplanes, and that's about it. What's he saying about what's going on? But there is this front, occasionally I'll put something up talking about what's happening in the world, but I don't feel that that's generally my place. Maybe it's not, maybe it is, I don't know. But there's things to consider about what we choose to say on social media, is essentially what I'm getting at. But then huge questions about what's going to happen to it in the future. Is there going to be a lot of digitalized history, not just social media, but in terms of
Yeah.
videos, documents, sound clips, I don't know, list them all, that could potentially be lost?
Yes.
And that probably wouldn't have been in the past if it had been written down in a book or whatever, or parchment or in stone.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah, this is the reason I think why a lot of sort of people in fields like ethnography and whatever are suggesting that if something was to happen now,
mhm,
and like there was a huge blip with our technology or whatever, it would probably feel very much like the fall of Rome.
yeah,
um Even though the fall of Rome is not, you know, the end all and make all of everything, but obviously it had a certain standard, it had a certain feel and access to information and knowledge and whatever that people obviously relied on. And it probably will kind of feel like that lapsus because we've accidentally created this perfect vacuum in which things could just literally disappear just by pulling a plug. And pulling a plug is incredibly easier than destroying hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scrolls. So, hey, there we go. Humanity, something to reflect upon.
Yeah. Well,
but,
that's, sorry.
On that note, I'm also becoming aware of the fact that we're a minute 45, and we said we were not going to get up to an hour. So, you know, this is what happened. But yeah, we're unfortunately going to have to start wrapping this up, James. So if I could please give you the floor to sort of pass any message about history as a subject or your field in particular that you think it may be interesting for people, whether it's people watching at home who may not be all that are aware of history, or people who perhaps, if they have that type of attitude, skills, or interest, could be really, really beneficial towards what you're dealing with and what you're studying. Please send a message out there to the world that may potentially get deleted in, you know, 100 years' time.
Wow, or 10 seconds if I got it absolutely wrong. No, I mean, I'm a firm believer that history is for everybody. I think I think, as I said earlier, it's the best subject. Everything's got a history. Everyone has that root, you know, that they've got passions, they've got something that they work for, they're interested in. There's a history to it. There's questions to be asked about, how, you know, why is this the way that it is, that go back, and we can learn a lot about ourselves, about the future, and take that forward. I think it's the best subject. As I say, I'm absolutely biased, but I think it's just, and mixing that with interdisciplinary approaches, so bringing out other subjects. So if you're interested in history, but your main thing is, I don't know, sociology or mathematics or something, there's still things to be brought into that in terms of understanding us as humans and such like that. There's plenty to bring in and different approaches to come into understanding. Yeah, I think it's the best subject, and I encourage everybody. And I think I'm a firm believer there's no such thing as a stupid question. So ask away. You're not expected to know everything. You know, that's what we're doing. You say about when you're progressing, taking history to an academic level, you know a lot more about a lot less.
Yeah.
In many ways.
So
But yeah, but that's fine. And I'm not. I'm certain. Well, I hope I'm not a snob when it comes to that. You know, you don't have to have these huge qualifications to raise big questions about history and to look into it. Absolutely not. I've gone down that route because that's what I have enjoyed doing, and it's led to that through life, or whatever you want to say. But I don't think anybody should be put down for having a passion for history, for being into it, and learning about the approaches to history. So understanding the historiography, the events that led to it, understanding about different voices being heard. And I think everyone's got a part to play in that. And yeah, hopefully that's good enough.
No, I mean, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, I think that's the general sort of narrative that we've been sort of developing through this very fluid discussion. Like, we've talked about a lot of stuff, by the way. watching the replay of this is going to be really interesting to see how we go from one thing to the other. But yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Again, I'm biased because I'm interdisciplinary historian myself. But it is, I genuinely think it's the way. We don't have just one slice of the pie. History is a huge cake, and there is space for everyone. So what I always tell people is that, you know, particularly in this day and age when it's so easy to feel disconnected, despite all of the tools that we have with the world, if you feel disconnected and you don't know what your place in the world is, well, at least you know that there is this link to this planet and to people before you that is worth exploring, that it's worth developing, and that it will help you feel less disconnected, but also help you understand your role in this universe, your role in the world, and that of, you know, billions of people more. So this is genuinely where the cool kids are hanging out.
I think so.
Well, yeah. But what are we gonna say, right? It's we get paid for this. So there you go. And that's unfortunately the end of our time today. Thank you so much, James, for being here. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you everyone who has watched now and that will be watching later. We really hope that this has helped somehow. And obviously we will be looking forward to having James again at any other point.
Absolutely,
And,
yeah.
you know, I think there's lots of conversations unfinished in here. So maybe we should try to finish at least one. And honestly, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the invite. I've absolutely loved this. It's been fascinating. So yeah, thank you.
That's all right. Awesome sauce. Well, I'll catch you guys later and take care. Bye bye.